This is New York. Hello and welcome to another star-studded edition of Shire Network News. We have our feature interview, which this week is a major coup, and we don't mean a military takeover. Shire Network News speaks to one of the most influential thinkers of our time, the pseudonymous Pakistani-born writer whose pen name is Ibn Warraq. He says, in the wake of 9/11, many Muslim spokespeople have been telling people in the West what they want to hear about the Koran and concepts like jihad, dhimmi and jizya. We were rather pleased when Mr. Warraq agreed to talk to us. We've long admired his work and, frankly, if more of the decision-makers in the world would just take the time to read and absorb his seminal work, Why I Am Not a Muslim, the world could get on with defending itself a whole lot better. Our guest is author and activist Ibn Warraq, who has been writing and speaking out against jihadi Islam for decades. His work on what the Koran really says and what the core of Islam is really about is the kind of writing and thinking that Islam's phobia of self-criticism makes impossible from within Islam. He is the author of many books, such as Why I Am Not a Muslim, and editor of The Origins of the Quran, The Quest for the Historical Muhammad, What the Koran Really Says, and Leaving Islam. His latest work is Defending the West, a critique of Edward Said's Orientalism. Shire Network News' Senior Inquisitor for Religious Affairs, Tom Paine, spoke to Ibn Warraq and asked him about the way the West is going about the task of defending itself.
Officially, in the West, where our governments are dedicated to the proposition that we're not dealing with a problem caused by Islam, we're dealing with radical jihadi Islamism, that this is a great religion which has been hijacked by a tiny minority of extremists. How true is that statement, do you think?
You know, politicians and people in the public eye, even journalists or scholars, not wishing to add to any kind of hysteria, have tended to play down the Islamic connection to the point of being completely dishonest by saying it has nothing to do with Islam. They're really twisting the truth. It has everything to do with Islam, as to say jihad in the military sense has been a part of Islamic doctrine right from the beginning. And this was a part which was developed by recognized philosophers, not by some fringe group, and in fact even by philosophers highly admired in the West even now, people like Ibn Khaldun or Averroes. So to say it has nothing to do with Islam is really dishonest. There are passages which we call the sword verses in the Quran, which quite clearly advocate fighting in the military sense. And they're not talking about some inner spiritual struggle, which is a notion which was developed much later in an apologetic context by in the 19th century, for example, by British Muslims during the Raj, when they were rather embarrassed by the rather belligerent verses in the Quran.
Well, a lot of modern Muslims are considerably less embarrassed by that these days. The level of Quranic knowledge possessed by a lot of the commentators in the West, what would you say about what people know about the Quran in the West today? I mean, we are constantly being told tiny minority of extremists, they've misinterpreted the Quran, jihad means in a struggle, that's the way that Islam is being presented. Do people in the West really understand what the Quran really says, which is the title of a book that you've written?
No, they don't. They absolutely don't. They just have to read it for themselves.
I tried that. It's a very difficult book to get through, extremely repetitive.
It is very turgid read, isn't it? It's rather full of non sequiturs, and it's really not a very elegant production, despite what the Muslims claim for it. No, people again. It's quite extraordinary how dishonest. I remember at the time of 9/11, soon after 9, I was living in France at the time. You had recognized pundits of Islam. One particular Algerian French scholar called Malek Chabel springs to mind. He was whisked onto French television day after day after day for nearly 2 years. He was on TV nearly every single day. And he said, and he actually wrote a preface to a French translation of the Quran. So he can't claim ignorance. He just barefaced lie. He looks at the camera and he says, there is not a single word which means to kill in the Quran. I mean, that's incredible.
Well, yes, there is. Of course there is. It's full of killing.
There are 52 uses of the word to kill. Qatala, meaning to kill. Arabic is qatala. And on many occasions, it's in the imperative. Kill. Get on with it.
And yet people in the West have this version of the Quran, this version of Islam presented to them, which is very peaceful. And it's clear that many people who, run opinion in the West, journalists, think tank people, politicians, want to believe, desperately need to believe this version of the Quran is the truth. Why do you think it is that many opinion formers in the West need to have this view of Islam rather than a more realistic view?
Well, this is it. First of all, the media is has been politically correct for the last 30 years or so. And the media has tended to be, on the whole, in fact, I would say, been very politically correct and very left-wing. And the left-wing particularly have been reluctant to admit that a so-called third world religion, although we can no longer call it that, but they saw it as that, is more nasty, more belligerent, more violent than good old familiar Christianity. They're willing to criticize Western civilization. They're willing to criticize Christianity. They go on about the Crusades and so on, and refusing to acknowledge anything to do with jihad in Islam. And of course, politicians have their own particular agenda. They do not wish to confront heads of states from Islamic countries, having said that their religion was, a load of nonsense and nasty and not worthy of respect. So they're obliged to deny that. There are all sorts of political pressures, but the most unforgivable thing is really the intellectuals. They have a duty to the truth, which they have not taken seriously. They have pretended, and all they had to do was to read some very basic books, including the Quran itself and 2 or 3 other non-apologetic books written, let's say, between 1920 and 1945, and they would have got the real picture. So there is a tendency in the West to blame everything on the West. This is a characteristic of Western civilization, what I call a self-criticism, one of the strengths of Western civilization, in fact. But unfortunately, this very strength can sometimes become a weakness because they refuse to acknowledge the weaknesses of any other civilization. They always put the blame on their own civilization, their own government, their own ways of doing things.
Well, we have a situation where intellectuals in the West blame all the problems of the world on the West, and intellectuals in the Islamic world also blame all the problems of the world.
Exactly. So you have the picture perfectly.